So, hello and welcome everybody. I can see a number of names appearing on the screen. Welcome to the ISO 2400.org webinar, specifically on sustainable procurement rail sector. This is the first time that we've done a sector-specific session, so we'd very much welcome your feedback on how it goes. A couple of admin points, if I can ask you please to go on mute so we don't get feedback and background noise. I will be introducing each of our speakers in turn who will come off mute and give us a perspective. Please do use the chat function in Zoom if you have any questions or if you have any comments. My colleague Caroline is also on the call, so she can help you with any technical issues if you can't connect or if you can't hear or whatever. So she's monitoring both the email, so you would have had an email from her inviting her to this session, and also the chat function. So if you do have any technical or logistical problems, please do feel free to contact her. So a very brief introduction. I'm Sean McCarthy. I'm a Director of Action Sustainability. The particular hat that I'm wearing this morning is as Director of Action Sustainability Community Interest Company. This is the not-for-profit arm of our business, and what we do is we sponsor and operate the ISO 2400 web domain, ISO2400.org, which is all about sharing knowledge and sharing experience in sustainable procurement around the world. So that website is available with content in many different languages, people from different countries. There's a very simple self-assessment tool against the standard there that you can use, and very importantly, all of that content is free of charge. This organization, this initiative came out of my engagement in the ISO 2400 committee that developed the standard over a 4-year period until its publication in 2017. We work with a steering group of former committee members that share our passion for developing the sustainable procurement agenda around the world. So this morning's session is going to be very much, I'm going to ask each of the speakers to introduce themselves and speak in turn. We're not subjecting anybody this morning to death by PowerPoint. We're just going to talk and give a perspective on sustainability from their part of the world, specifically around the rail sector and particularly some of the challenges in supply chains and procurement. And then we'll be inviting questions from the group. And I've got several questions, if nobody else asked the question, to really stimulate a conversation to help to share knowledge and share experience around this agenda. We're scheduled for around about an hour and a half. If we finish earlier, we finish early, but I can promise you that we won't finish late. So particularly for my first speaker, Alistair, who I'm going to introduce from Australia, and it's very late at night at the moment in Australia, so he certainly doesn't want to finish late. Alistair, would you like to introduce yourself and give us your perspective on the issues?
That's great. Thanks, Sean. Thanks for the introduction there. My role here is I'm with KPMG. Sit in the Sydney team here, and I'm a Director of Sustainability. So our sustainability arm covers off sustainable procurement, obviously, sustainable strategy. We get involved in property and infrastructure, which is my background, and we assist our clients from a consulting perspective to deliver on new buildings, new infrastructure, and also within the property space as well. So predominantly I'm going to be talking about the Sydney Metro projects that's happening in Sydney, and just going through that project I'll give a general overview of that project and then some of our involvement in one of the particular stations right in the heart of Sydney. So the central station, or Sydney Metro in itself, is a pretty large new infrastructure project for New South Wales government and Transport for New South Wales. And it involves 3 main lines crossing Sydney. The first one, which comes from the northwest Tallawong region, which is sort of 50 k's out northwest of Sydney through to Chatswood, which is the North Shore, has already been completed. That's about an $8 billion piece of infrastructure that's already been completed. Second part of the line is City to joining Chatswood in the north side of the harbour through the centre of the Sydney and then out to the west, out to Bankstown. And that's another $15 billion worth of infrastructure. And then there'll be another line which goes directly west, again joining from CBD out to the west of Sydney, about 40 k's out to the west to a place called Parramatta, which is essentially, geographically speaking, the centre of Sydney. And then later on down the line, there'll be a new Western Sydney Airport line. There's a new airport being announced and started construction out west, because Sydney Airport is constrained. So that's the overall project. Sydney Metro and Central Station is one of the first cabs off the rank. So it's faced the majority of challenges for a station of this type and infrastructure. Central Station, as the name suggests, it's right in the centre of Sydney. It is a pretty old station. It's on the first. It's a heritage building. The works involved refurbishment of that building, new walkways. It's a bit of a maze at the moment in terms of trying to navigate around, wayfinding around the actual station. So it's almost impossible to find your way from one side to the right platform. You probably end up popping out the other side faster than you do actually finding your way in the station. So there's a lot of wayfinding required, brand new concourse, and then a new metro box sitting underneath. Our involvement, we were assisting Laing O'Rourke in terms of winning the bid, in terms of all sustainability requirements that have been handed down from Sydney Metro. And we're working with them ongoing to actually deliver the sustainability attributes, specifically around Green Star rating, which is specific to the Metro box itself. So in terms of sustainability, it's targeting a 5-star Green Star rating, and that's the case for all of the Metro stations going forward. And also there's an ISCA rating, which is the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia, the ISCA Infrastructure Sustainability Rating Tool, and that's for the refurbishment works and the Eastern Walk. So sustainability initiatives that are going ahead, we've got a variety of things, and that's probably part of the challenges that we have on this project. It's pretty complex. There's a myriad of different social and sustainability requirements that are being handed down by Sydney Metro to achieve. There's also a significant amount of interface issues and complexities, because on the one hand, you have Sydney Trains running anything above ground. We have Sydney Metro building the actual Metro box underground, but then we also have line-wide interface, which is the tunnelling works currently going through and joining up with essentially the canyon that we're creating under the ground for the Metro box to sit in. So there's quite a significant amount of complexities in terms of just interfaces with other clients, shall we say, or other stakeholders in the piece, but also just drawing boundaries. Which part is in which sustainability rating tool, for example, but then also the interfacing technology that comes along with that, certainly when you're talking about BMS, the building management control systems, what interfaces with and what is required to talk to other systems within the station and within the Metro box itself. So from that perspective, there's quite a lot of complexity around the project. I think one of the other key challenges that I think that Transport for New South Wales and Sydney Metro have had is that when they started off on their sustainability journey, Transport for New South Wales that is, there were no real sustainability guidelines in place for infrastructure. So they created their own. And it was a pretty good set of guides and some prescriptive requirements there. And they brought out their guidelines back in 2009. But however, off the back of Green Star, which is your BREEAM or LEED equivalent in Australia, people started to think about, well, if we've got a Green Star for buildings, we need to have something similar for infrastructure. And hence the ISCA IS rating tool was brought out in 2012. So because if you're a client and you've got your own rating tool, then who are you benchmarking against? That's always the key challenge when you've got a single type of rating tool. And so when ISCA started to take shape and then started to be mandated by all governments across all states in Australia, it just made sense to start to change over from the Transport for New South Wales Sustainability Guidelines to ISCA. And then GBCA decided that they would bring out their own ratings for stations themselves. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges we've had. We've got the SWTC, the technical guidelines that are mandated contractual requirements. We then have an overlay of Green Star and an overlay of ISCA requirements, and still some legacy Transport for New South Wales guidelines, all cobbled together in one contract. And that's been a challenge in itself, because whilst Sydney Metro are moving towards a better model, and we were probably one of the first cabs off the rank, in the interim, we have some challenging metrics that are within those that are sometimes conflicting between the rating tools. But then we need to understand, how we can work with them and which ones prevail at the end to ensure that we meet our sustainability targets across the whole project. So that's definitely been a challenge. Other challenges are probably, certainly from a wider perspective for Sydney Metro, is that in terms of modelling, we've got detailed energy and comfort model to model the station and the metro boxes themselves. And various contractors are using different assumptions. So in terms of ground temperatures, air infiltration rates through the station, there's not a wide amount of data out there to say how much air volume is coming through your tunnels and how much is going to be infiltrating through from a train pushing through an underground tunnel, etc. So those types of parameters going into models were all different. And so it was a requirement for Sydney Metro to bring people together to say, well, how do we compare apples for apples and bring some standard sets of metrics across that will make sense across the wider metro line. So in the short period that I have, I think that sets the groundwork for a few of the challenges, but project is on track. There's plenty of other metro stations that are going ahead. Sydney Metro are ploughing ahead in terms of procuring the rail link going forward, and by all means, they're hitting some great targets. I mean, for example, operational energy consumption. There's a new solar farm that they've committed to offset 100% of all operational greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a great commitment from Sydney Metro.
Brilliant, thanks, Al. We already have one question in the chat, which you've kind of partly answered, but let's deal with it now before we move on. What was the most challenging sustainability requirement, and what were the lessons learned? I mean, I think you've talked about the complexity of the various different standards and different frameworks there. That it feels like somebody's kind of thrown the kitchen sink at everything. But in terms of specific sustainability issues, what do you think has been the most challenging so far?
That's a good question, and there's a lot because it's such a complex project. So I think probably the most challenging thing is it's actually drawing up the boundaries between the projects, because we've got sustainability boundaries for Green Star. So if you look at it in this respect, if you can imagine, we've got the existing station sitting on top. We're taking two of the tracks out that are heading north-south line to fit a metro box underneath. But then there's a concourse which sits on top. So in terms of a physical boundary, the Green Star box is everything underneath the concrete slab and including the concrete slab, but the tiles that sit on top of the concourse are actually ISCA. However, you've got central plant, which actually sits in the back of house area, which then serves the Green Star box, and therefore that has to be included. We're aiming for water credits, and then there's water credits for where's the potable water coming from? Is it metered properly? Is it metered to be ensured that you separate the ISCA rating from the Green Star rating from the line wide? So the interfaces aren't, the physical boundary is probably the easiest thing to solve, but then people have to come into the station somehow, have to get to the Green Star box. So therefore, where's your wayfinding? Well, it's pretty easy to get out of a station underground because there's only one way, it's up. But then if you're going for wayfinding points, you then have to piggyback off of work that's being done outside of your actual physical boundary, and then be able to work with the sustainability body, GBCA, so that they can understand the bigger picture and be able to identify that. So that's probably been the biggest challenge, really, is working through that, giving the GBCA the information, and then working with them to get them to understand exactly how it's split up and how it works, and how greenhouse gas emissions, for example, will be apportioned between the three major projects.
And just for clarity, Transport for New South Wales and Sydney Metro are different organisations, is that correct?
Yes, they started off, it was all Transport for New South Wales, but Sydney Metro was in the project itself. The wider project became big enough to then be substantiated as a separate entity and a separate organisation. So yes,
so that in itself is another challenge in dealing with different organisations, different standards, all in the same building.
Well, exactly. So it's actually Sydney Trains that runs the actual station above.
Yeah.
So there's yet another organisation who's in charge of operation, And then, of course, as I said, there's contractor interfaces in line-wide, which is the tunnelling works that is going on underground across the city, which will come into the box and then out the other side for the rest of the line. So that they're probably the biggest challenges, really, is to make sure that everyone understands where the boundaries are for each of those different elements, whether it be greenhouse gas emissions and energy or water or BMS interfacing, or and as I say, the physical boundary is probably the easiest one to actually demarcate.
Okay, thank you. So thanks to the miracle of Zoom, we can go straight from Sydney to London to talk to Tim about multiple modes of transport, multiple operations, multiple occupancy of the same space. Does that sound a bit familiar to you, Tim?
It does, yes. Thank you, Sean. Hello all, I'm Tim Rudin, and I head up a responsible procurement team for the Greater London Authority, which includes Transport for London, which I'll be talking from the perspective of today, given our focus on rail. And previous to my current role, I was directly at Transport for London for a number of years in different roles around sustainable procurement. So for those of you who aren't familiar, Transport for London is the integrated transport authority for the City of London, and therefore runs all of the transport services. Relevant for us today, that includes, of course, London Underground, the Docklands Light Railway in the east of London, the London Overground system, as well as a tram service in South London, and then a variety of other transport modes, including the surface transport network, so the buses, many numbers of thousands of traffic lights and main A roads in London, taxi licensing, and a cable car, wide variety. No balloons actually though, but so balloons are my own, but maybe that's something for the future. So our work on sustainable procurement, or as we look at it as responsible procurement, is governed by a responsible procurement policy, which is at the level of the Mayor of London, who sets the policy, and then it's down to Transport for London as one of the functional bodies of his organisation to deliver. There's 6 themes in there which cover the sort of the spectrum of social, economic and environmental sustainability. So I'll just go in a bit deeper in a few of those as I talk through. I thought it might be interesting to focus a bit on some of the social side as a bit of a sort of counterpoint to some of the environmental areas which perhaps get talked about a bit more, but of course we do plenty on that side too. So the area I'll start with is skills and employment. And the reason that's a focus for us, and has been for a number of years now, is that the UK has been experiencing a very significant skills shortage issue, particularly in the areas of engineering and related technical disciplines. This has been going on for, sort of all been building, should I say, for a number of decades, as the UK perhaps hasn't focused on things like apprenticeships, and meantime people that study some of these disciplines are tempted away to jobs in the financial sector, and actually all of the overseas infrastructure projects taking place in different parts of the globe. So there's been a consistent sort of reduction in the number of qualified engineers in the UK, and that has a direct knock-on effect on the cost for us, both the capital projects and the new programs, and also just ongoing operational service delivery. So this was recognised, and what we've done to address this is to start including requirements into contracts for our suppliers to create skills employment outcomes as a condition of doing business with us. And these are, there's a menu of options that our bidders can choose from. They include probably the priority area, which is apprenticeship starts, but also employing unemployed people and doing school visits to sort of encourage the future generations, and placement position. Now, hand in hand with the issue of the skills shortage is also the fact that the UK government in 2016 published a strategy which clearly laid out something that which many of us have been aware of but hadn't been quite revealed in such stark terms, which is the very unrepresentative nature of the workforce in transport, and actually in rail specifically in the UK. So the workforce was only around 20% women in the transport sector, and actually when they looked at rail engineering as a specific discipline, it was less than 5%. And also the UK in particular, London's an extremely diverse city. Around 40% of the population are from a Black, Asian and minority ethnic background. But the representation in the sector, again in engineering and particularly in transport, was nothing like that. So we realised that we were increasingly aware of a significant skills shortage, and also aware that we were not accessing pools of talent to maximise the opportunities. And also along with that, there was a real opportunity for us to use the jobs that are money, essentially, as clients when we are spending money, particularly on a new capital project, significant amounts of job creation, but actually we were keen, being a public sector body, that those jobs go to those who most benefit from them. So as a result of these sort of drivers, we've initiated a series of programs running pre-employment and work experience programs with our large tier 1 suppliers. The candidates for those programs are drawn from a network of charities and employability groups. So focus on unemployed people, perhaps ex-offenders who are particularly barriers to jobs, those with disabilities, and those that are underrepresented currently in the workforce. So people from a non-white background and women. So we've been running a series of these programs, and what's been good to see is actually the level of collaboration that our suppliers are happy to do. So organisations which are very much in competition with each other for contracts and generally are quite willing to sort of stand shoulder to shoulder and participate in these programs collaboratively, which makes them more powerful and worthwhile. And also some really nice joint working with other clients. So we've run some joint programs with the likes of Network Rail, HS2, High Speed 2, and Highways England and Heathrow Airport as well. So there's a sort of an expanding focus on these sorts of activities in the rail and transport sector in the UK. So that's quite gratifying. Naturally, with the impact of the pandemic this year, UK unemployment already has risen significantly, will be rising further. So these sorts of programs become all the more important and particular interest to the Mayor and to the Department of Transport. So more to come on that in the new year from us. As you'd imagine, there's quite a lot of overlap with the areas I was just talking about, and equality, diversity and inclusion. That's a major focus. Again, current events in other parts of the world and in the UK, I think, have brought even more focus on the equality and diversity agenda. So I was talking about how we are looking to ensure our suppliers are hiring from a diverse pool of candidates. Increasingly, though, we bring people in at the entry level, I think is extremely worthwhile. But one thing going forward is we want to try and understand what our suppliers are doing in terms of ensuring those people have opportunities to progress through the organisation as well. So we've made some good progress with job starts. So last year, our supply chain across all of transport, there was about 630 apprenticeship starts, and over 50% of those were people from a BME background. So we made some good progress on those entry-level roles, but really keen to see how our suppliers are doing in terms of management level and director level, board level, because I think there's still plenty of work to be done in our sector. Moving on to another area of focus for us is ethical sourcing, modern slavery. And I'm sure many of you will know and be working directly on the fact that modern slavery has really become an area of focus, I think, in the last 3 or 4 years or so, and perhaps not something that was on the tip of all of our tongues, a decade ago, but something that's been thrown into sharp relief, and plenty of studies and reports indicating the scope and breadth of the problem. And for us, it sort of is 2 areas. One is around the things that we're buying in our supply chains. So sometimes services, but perhaps more so kind of products. So for instance, for London Underground, our uniforms are sourced from Bangladesh and China. So we know that there's automatically going to be some risks there of human rights issues in the places where those uniforms are manufactured. So we've been putting requirements into our contracts for our supply chain to ensure that they have an annual audit at the sites of manufacture. But we're also aware that there's plenty of evidence to suggest that auditing on its own, it doesn't really get you too far. So we ask our uniform supplier to undertake capacity building programs. So something takes a bit longer than that audit, programs that would be enacted over the course of an entire contract, so 3 to 5 years. This could be training, capacity building, communications, perhaps the implementation of whistleblowing, hotline or an app maybe, and these sorts of programs. So not things that are enacted immediately. Those of you in a similar position will know it's both an advantage and a disadvantage. But when we do let contracts, we are entering into usually a fairly long-term relationship with the supplier. So that does give us an opportunity to work with them over a number of years to enact these sorts of things. But we're also concerned around modern slavery right here in London. And there's plenty of evidence to suggest that that's a major issue. So when it comes to capital projects in London at the moment, building a few new tube stations at the end of the Northern Line. We're doing a big upgrade to Bank Station, City, London. And while not directly under our umbrella, very much related, a sort of sister organisation is the Crossrail Project, which is the largest infrastructure project in Europe. Just finishing up, hopefully hopefully very soon. We're on a bit of a journey, actually. I don't think we've cracked it, but in terms of the risks of modern slavery and forced labour on construction sites in London, we're really trying to make sure that we have the best assurance process in there, and that our suppliers are really enacting best practice on the actual sites themselves to give us the best opportunity to spot the possibility or spot cases of forced labour and exactly how to respond to those. The message really is that it's everyone's responsibility to be aware and have that knowledge and awareness. Electronics, now we've affiliated to an organisation called Electronics Watch, which uses the combined public sector spend to have the opportunity to create influence or leverage with large electronics companies such as your Dells or your Apples or what have you, that individual organisations, even though we spend millions of pounds with those companies, we would never have really a lot of leverage or influence directly. But when we can pool our spend and actually be putting the same requirements into our contracts as public buyers across Europe and beyond it gives us a bit more of an opportunity to direct them. That began with looking at desktop computing products and mobile phones, but is now expanding into things like signalling. So we were one of the first sort of rail or transport authorities to affiliate, but they're having a few more now. So they are expanding their monitoring activity into the types of factories or sites that are making products for things like signalling and other products relevant specifically to the rail sector. Again, that's quite early days, but really interested to see how far we can go with that. Conscious of time, I haven't really talked a lot about the environmental side of things, partly because I thought others may talk about that area, and I kind of wanted to give you a bit of a flavour of the other things. But obviously plenty we're doing around carbon reduction on capital projects, value engineering activities, sort of get some results there. We use some certification in some specific areas as well to sort of fulfill the needs there. But perhaps that's probably about the right sort of time, I think. So I might stop there.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim. That was a really interesting perspective, and I think it kind of gives us that broad aspect of sustainability, thinking about jobs and skills and unemployment, and diversity and inclusion, and all of those things. There is one question on the chat we'll address, and by the way, you get the prize for being the first person to mention COVID, so well done. It's not an insignificant issue, obviously, for all of us. So the question: outreach for SMEs on reuse, repurpose, manufacture could be a great opportunity for job creation and a skills source, contributing to lessen the unemployment numbers, especially after the COVID era. So Melina, you get the second prize for mentioning COVID. Is there an initiative from the GLA in this direction? So this is all about reuse, recycling, small businesses, etc.
Yes, hi Melina, thank you for your question. Yes, there is actually. It's very timely for us actually, because what we've been putting together over the last sort of better part of this year is a small and diverse business procurement action plan, which is a bit of a mouthful. But really what it is we recognise that I think traditionally big public sector bodies across the UK and perhaps beyond, and perhaps specifically Transport for London and the Greater London Authority, have not been very easy for small and particularly innovative SMEs to contract with. So we've done quite a bit of stakeholder engagement and quite a few sort of workshops to really understand that high level, that headline. We can't get the contracts, what sits below that, what are the actual barriers and obstacles. So develop a plan with about 12 kind of overarching points in it, and some of them very much around that innovation piece. TfL does have an innovation hub where they put out problem statements and invite kind of initial kind of feedback on that, which then they can then take forward, which I think is really good. There's a lot of interest in that. It's not infrequent that we get approaches from small businesses with very innovative disruptor type technologies, keen to see if they can deliver to us. So it's not something we're going to solve in a day, because I think we've got the EU procurement regulations. We do still have the EU procurement regulation. We may have not for long.
Longer.
Exactly. So what there'll be, perhaps the UK's new procurement approach will make it a bit easier for the public sector to buy things. I think we will always need to go through, an extensive process to ensure it is fair and transparent. But yeah, we're really keen working with the team, working with the innovation team to really sort of say, how can we open it up? And awareness raising, I think, is the first challenge. So working with some organisations and engage with both small and diverse businesses to get the message out of who we are, what we do, how we buy, and also not just about contracting with us, but about, maybe the bigger opportunities of contracting with our tier ones. So there's work we need to do with our tier one suppliers to say, actually, how open are your processes to new and innovative companies?
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Interestingly, I was having a conversation with the operators of your cycle hire scheme this morning, and talking about buying the bikes. And they have two small businesses in the UK that they bikes manufactured from. And then there was a conversation about, well, what happens to the bikes at the end of life? Is there an opportunity for circular economy there? So they would be, those businesses are one or two tiers below your supply chain. But interesting to think about how influential your tier ones can be on the small business population. So that's really useful. Thank you very much. Okay, so again, using the wonders of technology, we're now going to move to the whole world, but Paris specifically. Lucy, would you like to give us a more global perspective on the issues?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Good afternoon for me, or wherever, morning or evening, wherever you might be. So I'm Lucy Anderton, work for the UIC, which is the International Union of Railways. And so if you've not heard of that before, you may, if you're not a member, we've got 200 members across the world, 100 different countries across the world. So we're a truly worldwide railway organisation. And altogether, that sort of is about 1 million kilometres of railway across the world. So we sort of cover a broad network. And also we work with lots of other associations and organisations. So about 100 different institutions we've got memorandums of understanding with, including being sort of the recognised UN official voice of the railways, if you like, for consultation on rail sector and representing rail sector at UN level. So which is very exciting for me to get involved in that as I lead the sustainability team here at the UIC. We're here to kind of help empower the railway community, I suppose, to really be that kind of driving force in a sustainable mobility and promote railway as a sustainable form of transport. And so we sort of set that vision, but we also provide lots of tools, but most importantly, actually convene the community, our members and our experts across lots of different topics. We've got 5 different technical sectors that we convene our experts on around air quality, energy and carbon dioxide, circular economy, noise and vibration, and sustainable land use, which is more the biodiversity and veg management kind of thing. So in our sector, we lead on the environmental sustainability, but work with other groups within UIC on accessibility, inclusive stations, weather resilience and climate change adaptation, and those kind of topics. But so I try and sort of bring a bit of a global perspective, a wider view, I suppose, of railway. But actually, I wanted to first sort of remind ourselves just how sustainable railway is just by design, just by the fact that a track on a wheel is really, really efficient. And while we know that transport's greenhouse gas emissions overall are still continuing to grow, but we know how critical the urgency is to reverse that trend, the quickest way to really resolve that issue is to shift to rail. And so the capacity and the modal share really has to grow for railways, because we are the most sustainable form of mass transport. I mean, if you look at the EIA, the International Energy Agency, with whom we work with a lot, to share data on railway energy use. For passengers, about 9% of modal share, and freight only 7% of modal share for transport in rail. But we only use sort of 3% of all of our transport energy, and that's about 2% of transport's greenhouse gas emissions. So we are sort of more efficient in that point of view. So it's clear that we should be taking a bigger role in transport going forward. And I think that's an opportunity as we've reached a bit of a crossroads, I suppose, globally, haven't we? And so really it's at that opportunity now to look at the future of rail and how it really needs to step up. So, I'll be the third person to talk about the pandemic, I suppose. And I think it's really highlighted just how essential the railways are to society, aren't they? And I think it's brought the railway community together with a common issue, a common problem. Certainly we've seen that at the UIC. But it's also kind of reminded us all just how inextricably linked, the railway is to social and economic fate, and how well and also the link between natural world and our own and human well-being. That kind of really reminded us, I think. But it's also dramatically changed public transport use. I don't know about you, but it was absolutely I'm sure Tim will have felt this as soon as the messages were going around of avoiding public transport. It's just like, no, this is like the backwards, such a backward step of the kind of messaging that we've heard and have been really trying to promote over the last few decades. And so, yeah, we dropped down, and we're still in most countries at a much lower passenger rate, but freight has grown. Freight has continued to be really strong and important, keeping our supermarkets full of toilet roll and things like that, you know. So, yeah, it's a time for reflection, I think, and crossroads, and looking forward to what opportunities there are to build back better. We've seen now from the United Nations, but also a lot of political leaders talking about building back better and that green and just recovery, which I think we really have to reflect on ourselves on the role of rail and the supply chain and what we can do to really contribute to that green and just recovery. It's a massive opportunity, I think. I mean, we're seeing unprecedented public spending, aren't we? Trillions of dollars are being spent now in the very short term as part of our stimulus. And a lot of governments are at least talking about a green economic stimulus packages. And really, truly green fiscal policy can really bend the sort of post-COVID emissions curve, you know, and railways can be, and public transport in general can be a massive part of that. Because actually, from the economic crisis last decade, we saw that any stimulus spending on public transport generated something like 70% more jobs per dollar spent than spending on highways, for example. So we know that the social value derived from really investing in the railways and in public transport is really there. And we need to, you know, we perhaps think about how we can better demonstrate that and really demonstrate the value brought by investing in public transport. Because at the moment, there's still these mixed messages. They're talking about green recovery and green industrial revolutions, but there's still huge bailouts going to fossil fuel industries, popping up industries and continuing those. So with these trillions of pounds being spent, only a few of those from analysis by there's an organisation called Vivid Economics have done some really interesting analysis on the stimulus packages, and the vast majority of economies are actually investing more in fossil fuels than in green recovery, and so we're seeing they're sort of a net environmental damaging stimulus packages from most countries. But leaders are European Union in what they're spending, including Germany, France, UK and Spain, all having sort of positively ranked green recovery packages. And hopefully USA's package will move quite quickly from what is a £3 billion, whatever it is, spent on fossil fuels to, you know, massive investment in rail infrastructure and public transport with Amtrak Joe in place. So lots of things to be positive about. But I think there's lots as an industry that we can do to help that kind of building back better. And I think, yes, we need to build back the confidence in public transport. And yes, we need to build back a much more interconnected, intermodal system. But in terms of like the role of procurement, I think there's so much we need to do in terms of supporting our people. And I think Tim touched on some of those massive opportunities that are already happening in London, and I'm sure around the world, really, about supporting our people, building back in terms of well-being of our workforce and the mental well-being, how challenging it has been in the last year, and what are we doing in our own workforce and in the workforce of our supply chain to make sure that mental health is addressed and people are supported. Yeah, spending those small and medium enterprises. What are we doing to sort of really support those social enterprises, supply chain partners, and yeah, to encourage more of that happening. And yeah, and how we can build that more diverse workforce and inclusive workplace as well. So they're the kind of things I think we can do for our people, but also it's building back green as well, isn't it? So from an environmental point of view, how can we use this point as a way to accelerate our decarbonisation, to really do some more ambitious targets to decarbonise the way that we build our railway as well as the way that we operate it. And I mean, hearing from Alistair about creating new solar farms dedicated to offset the operational energy is really exciting, and we're seeing more and more of that across our members. it also builds in that kind of resilience, and as well as just buying energy, it's actually creating, increasing the capacity of renewable energy and really playing a part in renewable energy revolution. And I think that's really exciting to start to see that. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, and then look forward to debate.
Okay, thanks very much, Lucy. And yes, a very eloquent defence of rail as the most efficient form of transport. As some of you on the call will know, I had the great pleasure of being the non-executive advisor to the Board of Transport for London for 8 years, I think, until relatively recently. And one of the challenges that I put down was around rolling stock. And I would always say, look, if you look at the progress of energy efficiency in trains, compared to what the auto industry has done over the last 10 years, say, in terms of the CO2 emissions per passenger kilometre, the auto industry is moving much faster and introducing a lot more technology. And some of the barriers that were always presented to me and why this is all very difficult, rail rolling stock is quite a small market. There's a small number of suppliers and a very large number of buyers, and there's, I think, 4 or 5 key manufacturers around the world. And trains last a lot longer than cars. So you buy a train, you have it for 30 years. You buy a car, you have it for 5 years maybe. So that was always kind of the reason given, or I might say the excuse, for not bringing in as much innovation into rolling stock for rail as the innovation that's going into the auto sector. And Tim, you might have a view, well, anybody might have a view on this. What's your perspective on the supply chain for trains, basically? And is that supply chain really stepping up to the carbon challenge?
Yeah, it's really interesting, because it is, as you say, it's really complex. So you've got, as you say, just a few people supplying. But then in the UK, for example, you've got people that own the trains, but then lease it to another operator who only has it for a short franchise. And then infrastructure managers are totally separate as well. So who's spending money? So people who have to, say, put in hydrogen refueling or battery line side infrastructure is totally different to the organisation that are building, owning and operating the actual rolling stock. So it's so complex that it's very difficult to coordinate that. And that sort of has only now moving forward because of some real clear policy and targets set by a government. In the absence of that, there's not been those kind of incentives to really build momentum to make a change on it. But the length of life of rolling stock is an advantage in that it's that's a long life cycle. From a circular economy piece, it's perfect, and we can retrofit, and there are retrofitting trains with hydrogen, for example. So it is possible to think innovatively if the right drivers and the sort of fiscal policy is there to do it, because the rail is an innovative industry, and we were the driving force of the first industrial revolution, and we must be the part of this third green industrial revolution as well, I think, with digitalization and much more interconnected, using digital platforms like mobility as a service and things like that. Manufacturers, you'll see that they're producing new and exciting rolling stock now, and orders are starting to increase. There's becoming real clear policy and targets around becoming net zero before 2050. So people are waking up to that. But there needs to be that clear policy, and the buyers and owners need to make that clear, this is what we want. And the manufacturers will react.
Yeah, thank you. I think I've seen word of some quite innovative solutions in places like Netherlands and Germany around hydrogen for branch lines and short train journeys where maybe electrification is not the right solution.
Yeah, that's right. I don't know if when we talk about Indian railways, there's a really incredible ambition around decarbonisation in India, which would be really good to hear about that.
Well, why don't we do that then?
Let's do that.
Let's do that. So Sanjay, hello and welcome. And sorry, I think you had a few problems connecting earlier. So we're very glad to have you on board. So yeah, would you like to give us, I know you've been a champion of sustainable procurement in India for many, many years. Would you like to give us a perspective from your part of the world, please?
Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be in the panel with the elite people. And situation, in India is quite different from what we heard about Australia and the UK, and also, a bit of overall focus on the railway as a whole. So I just want to take you back to the 1996 when actually I joined the Indian Railway. And when we joined the railway, we have to undergo training for 18 months before our services is confirmed on the railway. So during the entire 18-month period, we were taught everything, but we were not even given 18 minutes input on sustainability. So that tells you what was the level of awareness in those days, hardly 20, 25 years back in India. And we got the shock of our life in early 2000 somewhere when the one of the court they gave a ruling against railway that railway has to construct industrial waste treatment plant in their premises, before discharging is to the municipal sewage water. So we thought, okay, we were in the government, and how can a government, do harm to the society or do harm to the nature? Somehow we managed those issues and we started making the sewage treatment plant and industrial waste treatment plant. So that was the first encounter railway had with the sustainability issues. And today, as Lucia mentioned, like railway has very promising targets. By 2022, we plan to electrify the whole section, entire section of the Indian Railway network will be connected on the electricity. But the point is, even if connect do 100% electrification, unless those electricity comes from the renewable sources, it doesn't make much difference. So again, we have a target of to become CO2 neutral by 2030, and we are working on how to increase our capacity in the renewable sector so that we can become the carbon neutral. So if you look at the conversation around the sustainability which has been happening in India is about whenever we talk about sustainability, the entire focus and emphasis is placed on the environmental dimension of the sustainability. Social dimension of the sustainability, it takes a backseat as if either it is not there or we don't want to pay our attention on them. And the same things get reflected in how we handle sustainable public procurement in India. So we started with buying electrical energy efficient products, energy star rated products and so on. And we moved on to some of the other products where we found the opportunity. But going forward, we found that, okay, it's becoming difficult because we were not having the conducive legislation or policy framework which allowed procurement of the environmental and sustainable goods. So we thought, okay, this is the issue we need to tackle. So somewhere around 2017, we amended our procurement guidelines and the procurement framework. But after 2017, again, we found that, okay, this is not sufficient. Just having a public policy framework is not sufficient for implementing sustainable public procurement in an organization like Indian Railways or as a India as a whole. You need much more than that because your people are not well trained. Your market doesn't have a sufficient capacity, or even if they have, since we have not been giving any signal to the market, they are not responding to your demand, right? Unless we give the signal, how do they respond to demand? And many other challenges. So we went on, and we formed a task force at the Government of India level. The task force is currently working on sorting out these issues. But when I look at these problems are not unique to India. I also work closely with the UN One Planet Network on sustainable public procurement. And we realized that the focus of sustainable public procurement at most of the time is limited to the products, few products like the computer, maybe hardware, papers. So these are all a small impact value. But when you look at the spend is concentrated on the infrastructure, construction of building. There we are not focusing at all. Look at the amount of expenditure which is going to take place in next 10 years, I say. If there is an estimate that if world want to achieve SDG goals, we need to spend roughly about $1.7 trillion to $2.5 billion per annum. And at the same time, if you look at the government procurement, 60 to 70% of the expenditure goes on the procurement of buildings, construction, and other infrastructure like railways, highways, water treatment plant, and so on. And there is also, there are several multilateral banks, including the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, and so on. If you look at their spending structure, their spending is also at most of the time about 70 to 80% is on the building of infrastructure. And the latest intent is China, One Belt, One Road project. They are going to spend roughly about $5 to $7 trillion in 10 years. So if you look at the scale of investment which is going into the infrastructure sector, and just imagine kind of havoc that it would bring unless we start taking sustainability at the beginning, at the planning stage, at the design stage, at the procurement stage. So these challenges are unique, but at the same time, what I found is there are knowledge available. In fact, some of the countries, as it was mentioned by the in the metros, they have been taking the sustainability aspect to the construction of the metro. So there are knowledge available. But when you look at type search for the knowledge on the Google, you will get millions of entries, but we will not get the correct entries which is required to handle the procurement by a procurer. You try to look at the sustainability criteria for the metro, you just Google it. You will get several entries, but you will not find the correct, correct description and correct information which can be used readily available manner. At the UN level, what we have been trying to do to handle this problem is we are trying to create a online knowledge platform, SPP knowledge platform, where we are trying to put the quality resources. If you look at in the last 10 years or 20 years since the SPP has started all around the world, there are all kinds of best practices available on the internet. It's very difficult to find out again quality best practices which would be used in the different circumstances. There we are trying to promoting all the resources at a place so that anywhere people in the world who wants to access those resources, he or she could use those resources and apply them into their own procurement system. And at the same time, another part of our goal is to build a secondary material source platform. It's a kind of an exchange because many of the secondary resources are available in many of the countries. It has to be done at the local level or at the country level. It cannot be done at the regional or the continent level. So secondary resource platform is focused on how do we provide, if somebody has a secondary resources, it's a market platform basically, and if government or any public sector enterprises, they want to buy those resources, they can access and they can connect it and they can further do the contracting in it. But again, all this, whatever I'm talking, it involves, obviously it involves money and investment. But when you look at the world level, UN organization, you see, and when you hear about the UN, you see that they will not have the shortage of money. But in the last 1.5 years, we are finding for the donors to fund this project, right? And we still have not been able to get the required funding for managing this work. This is good work which will help the population, but we are not able to help the funding. And that is where, the role of, sustainable supply chain schools comes into the pictures. I remember I had a discussion earlier with you where many of the resources could be given at free of cost to people who want to access. So that is something, it's a very, very promising and very thankful for that. And probably, we will be taking it forward and try to get those resources. And then again, there was discussion about, the coaches and other things, and rail being the most sustainable mode of the transport, right? Since the day I joined in the railways, like we have been hearing about, the rail is one of the best mode of the transport, sustainable transport. So why do we need to innovate? But I agree with your view that the rate of, the change or the rate of innovation which is happening in the automobile sectors is much higher as compared to what is happening in the railway sectors. If you look at the automobile sectors, and the way they are focusing on a different kind of, they're moving from the electric vehicle to the hydrogen to the and so many other things. Same level of development is not taking place in the railways. So railway has a challenge again. How do we capture, especially after the COVID? How do we capture the market share, the lost market share? We used to have more than 50% market share both in the top passenger and freight business. But today, if I talk about the Indian Railway, our market share has come down to roughly about 1/3. So how do we capture the market share? And at the same time, how do we provide safety to the people, especially in the view of the COVID, when you have to keep social distancing in the mind? Because in future, whatever infrastructure we are going to build, we have to remember that this social distancing, we have to keep social distancing at the centers and accordingly design the infrastructure, because COVID is not the first pandemic and this is not going to be the last pandemic as well. Because the way we are interacting with the environment and the animal kingdom, we have forgotten that we are part of the same system. So health of the people is uniquely dependent on the health of the nature. So if we try to link them, and COVID has that highlighted that we are not separate, but we are part of the same system. So another point which it comes to my mind when we talk about the COVID is even in India, like when we see the supply chain in the railways, it had a big impact. For the first time, we realized that the value of the local suppliers, because we were able to manage supplies from the local suppliers, and the supply which was placed at the further off places well within India, even within the India, then we were not able to get them, and we had to struggle getting those material because everything was due to lockdown, everything was completely set. So I find that COVID has further, highlighted, how do we spend the trillions of dollars money which we have announced as a stimulus package all around the world. How do we use those money so that those monies are not spent on the same sector that has been responsible in some way for the COVID? We need to spend those money on the sectors or industries which not only brings benefit to the economy, provide employment, but also brings benefit to the society and benefits to the planet. So I think, in the next round, I will speak something more. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Some really powerful points there. Just to try and summarize about I guess, the need for rail to stay competitive, and this issue of, post-COVID, obviously that around the world people are using public transport less, I guess, are traveling less. And your point that this is not the first pandemic, it won't be the last. How does rail kind of stay competitive? I think there was also a really good point you made about kind of priorities. And yes, I do see a lot of organizations really buying, the most sustainable computer they can possibly buy, or stationery. We got green stationery where actually they're building buildings and infrastructure that have a much greater carbon impact or whatever. So I think there's some really good points in there. Can I just bring out another point that you made, which I must admit I found astonishingly good. The plan is for the whole of the Indian railway system to be carbon neutral by 2030. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
Wow.
I told you they were ambitious.
Yeah, it's super ambitious.
That is super ambitious. And do you have a plan to achieve that? That's amazing.
Yeah. See, I tell you, give you some background. In 2015, the UIC and the other railway joined hands together, and during the COP21, all the railway, asked to sign some kind of place to become a carbon neutral by so many things. So many of the railways, they signed that place. And we were not, at that point of time, we did not sign the place in 2015. And till now also, we have not signed the place as of now. But if you look at the, NDC, our NDC, nationally determined commitment for the Paris Agreement, what we have committed is we will reduce our GDP intensity by 30 to 35% from the 2005 level. And also by 2030, we will achieve 40% renewable in our overall energy mix. So this is and we have also committed by 2020, we will be building a capacity of 200 gigawatt of renewable. Now we have revised that target because we are already on a very good fast track. And we have revised that target, and we are now what we are saying is by 2025, we will be building 400 gigawatt of renewable capacity in India. So if you look at the way things are progressing and the momentum which is there, especially on renewable in India, so good, like we will be able to achieve. I don't see any reason at this as of now. But still, I tell you that the details need to be worked out, like how we are going to achieve exactly 2030, because electrification we are going to complete by 2022. Electrification will give us some benefit, but again, as I said earlier, unless we draw the electricity from the renewable sources, that will have very little impact. So we still need to work out, but yes, our pledge is to become carbon neutral by 2030. Thank you.
Wow. So Tim, does Transport for London have a net zero carbon neutral or whatever you want to call it ambition?
The Mayor of London also has a carbon neutral ambition by 2030, so that is aligned. I mean that's a London-wide ambition. I think the Mayor's sort of been clear that some of that is in his gift and some of that sits with central government. We have had the UK government bring forward the requirement that there'll be no new vehicles for sale after 2030. Yeah. So that's a recent change that sort of brings things closer, which is good to see. TfL's got some really interesting initiatives in mind. We've got a commercial development program, which is particularly focused, commercial development directorate, should I say, particularly focused on utilising the large amount of land that Transport for London owns across the city. So a fair bit of it unused, and some of it certainly not used to its best opportunity. And so it's things like, at the moment we're investigating the buy more of our power from sustainable sources, but actually the great ambition would be to actually have our own sustainable generation. So it's early days, so not really a lot of detail to offer, but certainly some initiatives and some investigations around can actually we start to build sustainable power generation directly on our land, or actually, if it's not appropriate to do that in London, but actually can we either commit very long term to sort of essentially buying and then almost as much as can be generated from a particular wind or solar source outside of London. So going into agreements, those clear agreements. Another thing is waste heat. So anyone who's been in London in the summer will know that the underground gets very hot, uncomfortably so. There's a lot of heat there in that system, which remains or is vented. So there's a few trials happening around utilising that waste heat for obviously heating. So, and I think they've gone quite well. I think there's one other new housing development in North London that I think it's gone quite well, and they're expanding the pilot. I don't have a lot of the detail, but so these are the sorts of things that are being trialled and kind of pushed forward to hit that 2030 target.
Brilliant, thank you, Tim. Al, you mentioned in Australia that there's a plan to buy into a solar array to support renewable energy for the project that you're working on. Is there a bigger picture around policy in Australia and net zero or carbon neutrality in transport?
Yeah, there is. Australia is pretty challenging, as you probably know, and you've probably heard some pretty nasty stories about our lack of commitment from a federal perspective on carbon and climate change, which is a shame, because it's really driven by, decisions that were made in the 70s from the, policy decisions made by governments around the world when the Saudis turned the tap on the oil. Back then, UK would turn to nuclear, France turned to nuclear, Denmark turned to wind, US actually, funnily enough, turned to energy efficiency, and Australia had a ton of coal in its backyards. That was the policy set. Now we have massive internationals which essentially create are members of the Fossil Fuel Council, and they have the ear of the government, plus other things probably. But anyway, we won't go into that. That's the challenge. However, New South Wales government has just recently committed to 2050 targets. They've been pretty aggressive in this. Sydney Metro, as we said before, the Northwest Rail Link's already being offset with a solar farm out at Beryl, and the rest of the network will also be offset by power purchase agreements, essentially, which is a fantastic tool to really drive investment, because it gives commitment in the industry to put money into solar and renewables. And why wouldn't you? My thinking around renewables for Australia is just a no-brainer. We're seeing manufacturing from car manufacturing disappearing offshore because it's too expensive to operate here. We have the world's leading experts in solar research in UNSW. They put out a world record every year with commercially available plant. 40, I think they're up to something like 40-something%, 45% efficiency of solar just from commercial products. So it's pretty amazing what they're producing. We just need to get the investment from government to then flip the manufacturing plants into solar manufacturing, and then we support 3 industries, because then you've got the trades installing. So there's a lot of work going on from a commercial sector. Business sees the writing on the wall. They're not waiting for government, and they're pushing forward. That said, South Australia was completely powered by renewable energy just a few weeks ago for a whole day. We're at 22%, I think it is, across Australia in terms of our renewable mix. But as Lucy mentioned, we have some adverse decisions coming out of the COVID crisis, where the federal government has announced a gas-led recovery, which is going to be an absolute disaster, because most of that is potentially going to be fracking. And to put it in context, there's already contracted, I believe, already been contracted 40,000 wellheads to go in Queensland alone. Now, each pinprick, they estimate that the wells, typically 50% of wells fracture within their lifespan. They're all going through the Great Artesian Basin. The Great Artesian Basin is our aquifer that runs from Katherine, which is up in the north, all the way down through to Adelaide. And once you pollute that, that's it. It's gone. And it supports the whole farming. And we're one of the few countries in the world that's positive in terms of biodiversity at the moment anyway. So there's some significant challenges with that. And I think that's really, it's a knee-jerk reaction supported by significant lobbying from big business. And we all know it's the same everywhere in the world, isn't it, at the moment? There's 90 companies that have put 2/3 of the carbon emissions up in the atmosphere and are making a lot of money out of that sort of that. So there is some good commitments, to answer your question, but there's some great opportunity to push it out even further. And the New South Wales government has made some great commitments recently in doing that. In the next 10 years, they've committed to putting in 300,000 solar battery plants across New South Wales. So really to drive that renewable transition, which is great to see.
Okay, thank you. So depressing, but some green shoots of optimism potentially.
It's depressing from a federal government perspective, but it's a similar sort of story in the US in a way. You've got the federal government over there, but then you've got some states that are ploughing ahead because they just know that it just makes sense to. Yeah. And I'm sure in the UK you've got similar scenarios.
And also seeing a lot of big corporations just kind of doing it anyway, almost in spite of government. So and particularly very large American corporations, Google, Apple, IKEA in Sweden, and those sorts of organizations kind of beyond government in some ways in terms of the way that they act. Lucy, if we can maybe ask you for a final contribution. We seem to have got into this conversation about carbon neutrality and net zero, which is obviously really important for the sector. Are there other parts of the world that you're seeing that are doing ambitious things around carbon?
Good question. I think it's we've got 34 members who have committed to being carbon neutral before 2050, and Sanjay mentioned that declaration, and I'll look to him to see when he is getting ready to sign that declaration, and I don't know why is leading on this. That we're trying to build that community and the momentum for decarbonisation, and to convene those experts to help sort of support each other and work collaboratively of how we can set out a roadmap for rail to decarbonise. So we've got great big long list of organisations that are really leading on this. As you say, Germany and the Netherlands are really strong, and Austria as well, really, and Luxembourg, the whole free public transport for everybody, amazing.
Wow.
So, yeah. It's free to travel public transport in Luxembourg for everybody. So, how else do you make that shift for passengers? That's just fantastic.
Mind you, Luxembourg is quite small.
Well, yes, absolutely, yeah. And there's lots of reasons why it's easier for them than other countries. But, those kind of sort of showing confidence in public transport and those kind of messages are really, really clear. But Japan Rail East and Japanese railways have also got some strong, and Korean Rail as well, some strong plans in place to decarbonise there. So just the expansion of high-speed rail globally is just stunning, and the importance of high-speed rail is the competitiveness to short-haul aviation, how important that will be. And the rate of expansion of high-speed rail in China is mind-boggling, and that's expanding all across the Asian Pacific, linking in internationally to other countries across the Asian Pacific region. So some really exciting stuff going on there, and we're very excited to see what Amtrak Joe has got in plan for expansion of rail in the US and North America.
Okay, thank you. It's a really good point as well about the competition between high-speed rail and short-haul flights. And I think, countries like France and Germany are looking at cutting right back on short-haul flights. And to Sanjay's point earlier about the pandemic, it's quite difficult to socially distance on a train, but it's a lot more difficult on an aircraft. so that there are clearly strategic issues in there. I think we're rapidly running out of time. I could talk about this all day, but I think we're going to have to wrap now. So firstly, thanks to all of our speakers. I think it's been quite a fascinating debate. The whole rail sector is such a massive issue for sustainability and for supply chains going forward. And I hope this has given our audience a bit of a perspective on some of the issues, and that you've learned something. This session is being recorded. We will be getting it edited professionally and then putting it out on the website in the very near future. Then we'll be promoting it through social media. So for those of you on the call, please do take the opportunity to promote these. We see a lot of uptake of people looking at the recordings of these sessions. So we did a session on sustainable procurement performance measurement a couple of months ago, and we've had over 1,000 views of that recording. So please do help us to promote this so we can get the word out there. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and wherever you are in the world, enjoy the rest of your day, morning, evening, or whatever time zone you're in. So thanks very much, and have a great day. Thank you.